This is the Blackout Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Blackout Podcast, where I get to talk to amazing people that do amazing things. And today I'm super happy to have Trevor Murphy of Pigeon Row, Acadian Embassy.
Acadian Embassy, yeah.
Sweet. Thanks for coming on the podcast today.
Oh, thanks for having me.
So tell me a little bit more about Trevor Murphy.
Well, I'm a person who does a lot of things, I guess, but most of them stem from and revolve around my love of music. So by day, I am a publicist, and I mostly work with music folks. Like I'll work music festivals, but also artists and album campaigns and tour campaigns and things like that. Then I also have this little record label called Acadian Embassy, which is very small, very family kind of oriented, and focuses on just independent music and also talking a little bit about cultural identity as sort of a subsection of what we want the label to be. And then on top of that, I'm also a musician. I play in some bands, and my band that I have on the go most currently is a band called Quiet Parade, which I've had for about 10 years now.
Awesome. And we didn't even say the host of the record award-winning show, Halifax is Burning.
That's right, yeah. It's also a show I have on CKDU 88.1 FM in Halifax.
Yeah, I mean, if you look, it's like it's just won everything, and but not just that, it's actually played not just around in Halifax, it's syndicated in other places.
Yeah, there's a few other markets that play. Most of the maritime stations will play them, and I know for a fact that CJSR in Edmonton also plays it. I actually got a message from somebody in Edmonton the other day who said they heard the show on the radio and they had some questions about one of the bands I was playing. So it's like a neat feeling too.
Sweet. So where did this love for music start?
Man, I don't know. Like music was always around when I was a kid. Not in the way where like my parents played music, but I just always remember being fond of music and always being an important part of like the reason for gathering with people in my childhood. Like I remember bonding with people over music, and I don't really know how that was instilled in me, other than the fact that my mom specifically did listen to music, and we would go on like Sunday drives and listen to Fleetwood Mac records and Cat Stevens records. And, I don't know. It for some reason, it just clicked with me, and it always has, I think.
And then when did you start playing an instrument?
It was quite late, actually. I was 16 when I first started playing music, and I learned how to play bass first.
Oh, okay.
Thought it would be easier. There's only 4 strings. And I learned a lot of the fundamentals. I'm completely self-taught, and I moved from bass into guitar and then eventually into singing and things like that, too.
Oh, okay. Wow. Do you remember the first song you wrote?
Oh, no, I don't remember the first song I wrote, but I can assure you it probably wasn't that good. I think when I was first starting to learn how to play guitar, I was learning very simple songs. I was really into bands like the White Stripes and things like that, because those songs seemed very catchy and very good, but also very simple not in a bad way, but in a way that like I can play this too,
Yeah.
And even on bass, like I was learning songs by Gob and just like really Blink-182, like very simple kind of 4-chord root note kind of stuff, and that sort of helped me understand the more complex stuff around music sometimes.
And what was the process of learning? Because you say you're pretty much self-taught.
Yeah, so basically what I did was I didn't even know how to play an instrument, and I bought a bass. I think I bought it on eBay.
Oh,
I was like
okay.
very much an eBay kid at the sort of dawn of the internet. So I just bought this bass. I thought it looked cool. It was relatively cheap. Showed up, and I learned. And the thing that I did, the first way that I learned how to play music was I actually like made myself a chart on a Bristol board.
Oh.
So it was like E, A, D, G, the chords in the strings on the bass, and then 0 through like 25. So it was sort of like a visual chart of saying like, okay, if I'm playing the E string open, that's E. If I play it on the 1, that's F, and et cetera, et cetera. And so that way it taught me some of the songs I wanted to learn how to play. I was really just like listening to music and reading tabs online. And some of the songs I couldn't find tabs for, but I could find chords for. So I thought, if I know at least what the chord is, I've got a starting point. And that gave me a good like fundamental knowledge of where everything was on an instrument, on a stringed instrument.
But like, wouldn't it just be easier to go learn from someone?
It could have been. I don't find myself like I'm the kind of person when it comes to learning something like that, specifically something when it comes to music, that I just sort of like, it has to lock in to myself. Like, I learn much better if I can teach myself rather than watching somebody else do it. Like, even if somebody was teaching me, the learning process, I think, for myself would come from going home and just
And
like
doing
honing
it
it
and
and
doing it.
repetition and doing it and doing it.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think I never really thought it. And also where I grew up, I kind of grew up in a rural place. I didn't really know
Where
any.
did you grow up?
I grew up just outside of Yarmouth on a place called Surratt's Island. So it's
Okay.
about 25-minute drive to the town of Yarmouth proper.
Okay.
So there wasn't really, I mean, there was like bands that I knew in high school and stuff, which is also kind of what kickstarted my interest in local music particularly, and getting involved in like the high school music scene and things like that. But I didn't really know anybody who played bass, let alone taught bass.
Gotcha.
So it
gotcha.
just didn't really seem like an option. I never really even thought about it, to be honest.
Okay. And do you find that method of learning comes into pretty much everything you do?
Yeah, definitely. Like, I'm very much a learner who needs to experience. Like, I'm an experiential learner. So I can watch a tutorial on YouTube to learn how to do something in Adobe Premiere or whatever when I'm doing some video editing. And I can follow along, but I'm not going to remember until I do the steps myself and do it a couple times. So I think everything I do kind of has that aspect to it.
I think that's a great way of learning. And that's one thing some people don't do, is that repeating the pattern part. Like, you do it once because you follow someone and it comes out great, but if you don't do it over and over again, you always have to go and refer to that video. And I'm talking about myself.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
I do
I'm
that
very
a
much-
lot.
I mean, I've looked up the same tutorial videos a lot of times. You know what I mean? It just doesn't. It has to stick at some point. So.
You have to stick at some point. And did you form? How long before you formed the band?
It wasn't too long actually. Like, I kind of, before I even started playing an instrument, I was sort of jumping in and trying to sing with a band in high school and stuff like that, which also not very good. And yeah, I mean, I think by the time I was always, because I played bass, I was not frequently, like I wasn't in high demand, but I always seemed to have a band. Like, I was able to play with some friends of mine. The first real band I think I played in terms of being a band that made an album, was a band called Alan Benjamin. It was two of my best friends from high school and myself, and we were just a three-piece.
Was anybody Alan Benjamin?
It was like the front person's middle names, kind of. So it was sort of like he tried to treat it as this like alter ego kind of thing.
Gotcha.
And that was the first time that I kind of really learned how to be in a band, to play. I had played shows with other bands before that, but this was sort of like, okay, we're going to go into the studio, we're going to make a record, and we're going to save our money.
You made a record?
Yeah, we made 2 records actually with that band. Yeah.
What was that experience?
It was really interesting, actually, because until then I hadn't had any studio experience. And that was, I think, sort of formative. And I'm the kind of musician who could just be in the studio all the time. Like right now, when we're with my band Quiet Parade, we're in this phase where we're writing new music, and we've got a couple songs done, and we're in the studio right now. And just last week, for example, we were in the studio and just cutting a demo so that we could kind of refine it and work it out for the record.
And what studio do you work at?
Right now, we're recording part of the album at New Scotland Yard in Dartmouth.
It's so cool.
Yeah,
it's
nice
so cool.
But we were doing some demo recording at the Golden Palm, which is also a rehearsal studio run by Palmer Jameson.
Okay.
Yeah, so I just found myself in that moment, just like really falling in love with studio life, and I'm like, I love being in the studio, and I'm constantly working to get us in the studio. Like, the goal of my band currently is just always like, okay, let's have enough money in the bank to make another record, you know?
Okay. And so do you write the songs for Quiet Parade?
Yeah, I mean, I think it started very much because, okay, so I was in many of this bands. So I played in a band called Alan Benjamin when I lived in Yarmouth. Then I moved here to Halifax, and I started playing in a band called The Establishment, which was the drummer, Josh Pache, who we call Pinky. Who played in Alan Benjamin with me. And then he moved up here, and we started playing in a band with our friend Mike Dion, who was playing in a band called Capsize that we both just loved when we were in high school. They were like the high school band, you know? So we started playing in a band together with him, and that was called The Establishment. At the same time, both of us, Josh and I, joined a band called Sleepless Nights, which was a band formed by Aaron Wallace, who we went to high school with, but he was a couple years older and had already been living in Halifax and playing in some bands. So I was always the bass player in these bands. So I started playing Quiet Parade stuff as a way for me to just, play my own music, because I wasn't writing those songs for the most part. I was holding down the low end kind of thing. So when Quiet Parade first started, I played everything, or like I sort of conceived of everything. I would come to people and say, okay, we're going to go make this record. Here's how I want it to sound. And for the first couple of records, that's sort of the orientation. And then eventually what started as a side project became sort of my main project. And the people, I kept bringing in musicians to back me up if we had shows or to play on records. And then eventually those people just became the same people all the time. And eventually we just started writing songs together. So now musically, like more of the ideas are coming from the group, but I still spearhead a lot of the ideas, the arrangements, and I do 100% of the lyrics.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's a lot of work.
Yeah, but it's fun. It's fun work. Like, it's
Yeah.
motivating work. That's kind of one of the things that really helps with the formation of having other people having a scenario where you allow other people to kind of impact your creativity. For me, what is most fun right now about the band is like working together with the other people in my band on something, on a piece of music, and then saying, okay, we've got this verse, this chorus. I'm gonna go home and I'm gonna try and work out some of the rest of the parts, and I'm gonna come up with the lyrics, and then I come back for the next rehearsal and we've got something to work on even further. So I find it very motivating to have other creative inputs and outlets kind of coming into the fold.
Oh man, that's great. It's like having this set of people that just understand you, and you kind of bounce ideas off each other.
Yeah, and we all come from different places and stuff and different musical backgrounds. So I think what we've really succeeded in doing is like knowing what the common ground is among our group, and using those resources to kind of come to some coherent and cohesive piece that really makes sense for who we are as musicians and as a group.
And then Quiet Parade. Oh, you came up with the name?
Yeah, I honestly have no story for it. Yeah, like it's one of those things where I was just like, I think I was walking down the street and I thought about that phrase and I was like, that's pretty neat. Kind of like the vibe when the band first started, it was kind of like a more kind of like folk poppy kind of scenario, and it's kind of gone through different formations. Like sometimes it veers a little alt country, and this new music is sort of veering more into the pop rock straight up, and I'm like now playing bass in the band. So we were a 5-piece for a long time, and in that guitar, it was always my band where I would write the songs on guitar and play them and sing them and play guitar. Recently, in the last year, I've started playing bass. We've gone to a 4-piece, and I've just taken over the bass duties, but I'm also fronting the band still. So it's like a new thing. But the way that I play bass, the style that I have, really kind of dictates the kind of songs I can write and sing in that formation too. And those tend to be because of my affiliations with bands like Sleepless Nights, who was kind of like a power pop band. The way I play bass, it's a lot of eighth notes. It's very like it's punk rock in its style, I suppose, but the music I play is not really punk rock. It's just a lot of the like downstrokes, a lot of fast kind of stuff. So the music we're writing now is a lot more upbeat and peppier and more. It's got more of a rock slant for sure.
And with the titles, like, do you have any song titles that just sound out there?
Out there? No, I'm one of those people who like, I'm very influenced by pop music and like the pop structure, and I'm a big Taylor Swift fan and Katy Perry and like stuff like that. So I remember somebody saying like, what will people Google? If they hear your song on the radio, what's the thing they're gonna Google? So I always try and think of that when I like. So there's not a lot of titles that you're not gonna hear in the chorus of my song, for example. So I'm always just conscious of just being weary of the experience for others.
And
too.
what was the last song you guys recorded or plan to record now?
The song we just demoed, which is probably the next song we'll go into the studio to do, is called "Nervous All the Time."
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
What is that about?
It's, I don't know, like songs for me don't necessarily come from, like they start at a certain spot, and I always kind of come to the table with an idea of like, okay, here's what I want to say with this song. But then as you're writing, like by the time you get to verse 3 or something, your brain is in a different spot. So they kind of maintain a thematic element throughout, but then for me, they always kind of like veer in and out of stories. So it's always hard for me to say like this song is about this thing because it's kind of about 5 things, I suppose. And I had that line going around with me a lot, just based on a song actually that we used to play with Sleepless Nights. And it was, I can't remember the exact line. Oh no, the line of the song that Aaron wrote was "People make me nervous, whiskey makes me shake," and I always thought like, oh, that's a fucking really good line. And then I sort of just have tried to co-opt it into some way, and it ended up being this. But the story of the chorus, I guess, at least in this song, comes from a sort of text message that I had with a friend of mine of just being like really trying to be really supportive of going through like times of change and tough times, and like the lyric of the chorus is like, I am yours and you are mine, like don't forget, like we're here for each other. But then I kind of throw in this line so that the ending is like, I am yours and you are mine, but I get nervous all the time. So it's sort of a reflection on just, never being quite certain and never being quite 100% on the decisions you're going to make, but understanding that you kind of need to lean into the nervousness sometimes for good things to happen.
True.
Yeah.
True. I agree. I mean, that's a powerful song. I like that title though. Never all the time.
Yeah.
Wow, so cool.
It kind of grabs you a little bit.
And
I hope so.
Do you like this song?
I love it. Yeah,
Okay.
like it definitely. It's a song that I think when people hear these new songs from us, like we haven't really been. We've played like one or two shows where we've kind of debuted this formation of the 4-piece. So I think a lot of people who know our band, when they hear this new music, they're going to be like, okay, same band, but this sounds different, and it's obviously going in a different direction. And this song, I think, of the rest, is the most kind of far out there. It kind of really leans into, I don't know, there's like a spookiness to it. The chords are really interesting, but then it opens up into sort of like a major chord chorus. But the way that the drums and the bass are interplaying, the kind of activity of all the stuff, I don't know. I think people are going to hear this and go like, oh, wow, I could make, like, if you followed us for 10 years, you might say like, I could see this coming, or this has always been there, but it's just amplified. But if you know like two of our songs, you might think like, oh, this is a different band now or something.
Oh, wow. So man, with such a very, I guess, like enterprising music background, what brought you into public relations with Pigeon Row?
Yeah, like I went to school for...
What is even the story behind the Pigeon Row name?
That is not a question I'm like super equipped to answer. It kind of... I work for this guy named Matt Charlton, and it's his company, so he's the kind of creative genius behind all that stuff.
Gotcha. I
think the real answer is kind of mundane, and there's probably, similar to the Quiet Parade story.
Yeah.
But I started working for him because I went to journalism school. I did a 4-year program at the University of King's College and did the journalism program there, the Bachelor of Journalism. And what I really wanted to do was like do writing for magazines, and specifically arts features and things like this. So even going into journalism school, I was like arts focused, and sort of at the tail end of that, finishing that and then going into a completely different discipline thereafter. He was dating a friend of mine, and I knew he was starting this business, and I kind of just said, if you ever get to the point where you need some help, like I've got the skills, I'd love to help, and I'm really interested in sort of this aspect of helping musicians, which is essentially a publicist's job. When you're working with a client, your job is to help them achieve their goals. And then when it got time for him to be able to kind of take on some people and hire, like he would just hire me like on a contract basis to work, a couple hours a week to do certain things. And I did that for 5 or 6 years, and then that kind of eventually transformed into this being a full-time job.
And then what do you do? I mean, I know you publicize artists, but what are some of the specific things you do?
So like I always say like our job is to, anything you read about an artist in the press, it's sort of our job to make that happen or set that up or facilitate those conversations. So whether that's interviews with a newspaper, radio spins on like CBC, reviews of an album. My job is to sort of go out and source all those people who are writing those things or doing those interviews or doing that reporting and turn them on to the people that I'm working with.
Oh, wait. Okay. So, I mean, Pigeon Row is pre-established and you work with a lot of festivals now. If an artist is just starting out, it isn't the right time to come talk to Pigeon Row, would you say?
Yeah, I mean, I think right now it's a particularly difficult time. Like I've worked for over 10 years as a publicist and have noticed of a shrinking of the mediums out there in terms of resources, in terms of availability, all these things, right? So it used to be we'd be able to send out a press release and 5 or 6 people would just pick things up from the press release, whether they would be bloggers or more established kind of outlets. And now the things like that are happening less and less. So I think like it's not impossible for a first time band to have a really great record and to make a good impression. I think what's always important is sort of like the story you want to tell, because right now anybody can put out a record, really. It's getting easier for people to make music. It's getting easier for people to distribute their own music through the internet and put it on Spotify and all these things. So the question you have to ask yourself is like, how can I stand out above that pack?
Yeah.
And my experience has been even if it's a first time person, if there's a good thing to talk about, if there's an interesting thing to talk about there, we've got a better chance of getting those people's attention. So that would be my recommendation, is sort of like, no matter what level of client I'm working with, the question I always have is like, okay, what's the story here, and how can we make this more than artist X has created a new album?
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. I didn't even think of that, because sometimes I'm always like, oh man, this guy is in the city, whatever, is making great music, and it'd be great if XYZ person is talking about the person. But then you sit back and think about it, but like, okay, so they are just 10 people are putting out great music,
Yeah.
and like you can find it on Spotify. But you're right, it's about finding that distinct thing about this person that kind of sets them apart from the other 20 people that are doing the same thing.
Yeah, like you always have to ask the why. Like, why would somebody want to talk about this, And there are people out there who are very much like music purists. So the why could very much be, this record's amazing. But I think there are fewer and fewer of those people, and even those people who exist. And I'm not saying that people like just have abandoned the will. It's like when it comes to something like a newspaper, it is very much an issue of resources. So I talk to people sometimes who are very on board with some of the things I'm working on, but they're like, my editor wants me to write about Drake.
Yeah.
Which is like, I like Drake, but I've always struggled with this idea of like, is it a chicken or egg scenario? Like the idea is like, people don't want to read about a new artist, and it's like, well, do people not want to read about a new artist because they're not reading about a new artist, or do they really only care about reading about the sort of high level profile artists that we have? And in Canada, by the way, when you're talking about Canadian media, we have more sort of global megastars now, I would argue, than ever before. So it's easier to get your CanCon kind of contributions in the door by talking about something that like a mass amount of people will understand and know,
Yeah, it's true. Yeah, I did. Wow, so much. Well, I guess that helps, because you've done this for 10 years, so you pretty much know what you're talking about. Do you remember the first, maybe not the actual first one, but the first project at Pigeon Road you were super excited working on?
When I first started, I mean, we get cool stuff coming to us a lot, and I'm always just like very thankful. And also this company has like turned me on to some music that I probably didn't know about, or I've kind of come to really appreciate. But I would say when I first started, my job essentially was to kind of do like campus radio tracking and mail outs, and really develop a section of the company that was focused on campus radio. And to me, as someone who has been, I mean, at the time I wasn't involved in radio really. I was kind of just getting my feet wet over at CKDU. But that I think really excited me a lot about that job. So it wasn't necessarily a client, it was the job in particular.
Gotcha.
And just being in touch with community and campus radio stations across the country, and understanding how like important those charts are to the artists that you're working with, and just making, because I mean, for a lot of the people we're working with, even to this day, campus and community radio is the only kind of radio that's going to play them. So making sure that people can have access to this music and be able to actually play it on air is something that I believe in, not only as a person who has that job, but as just a person who lives in a community where, to me, music is of the utmost importance.
Yeah, we love music here in Halifax, really.
Yeah.
And what do you think of venues here in the city?
I mean, I think we've gone through some changes, certainly. Like there's no there's no denying it. When I first moved here in 2002, it was sort of, I would call it like the second golden age of like Halifax music. So I was coming in really hot on the scene of like, dependent music was a record label based kind of between Halifax and Toronto at that time, but originally kind of its origins started in Yarmouth, which is where I'm from. So it was something I had followed for a long time, and I followed some of those bands kind of to Halifax. Winter Sleep, for example, like their first record came out in 2003, and they were one of the bands that, because they had members from Yarmouth and they'd always been part of this scene, that I just definitely like latched onto and followed around, literally followed them around to shows and stuff. And so I feel like at that time it was kind of the culture where you would just kind of stop into a bar because there was music going on and it didn't really matter. And I remember a big thing about that era being a really eclectic bills. So like Winter Sleep would play with Big Game Hunt because they were friends, but Big Game Hunt was like a real stoner rock band, and Winter Sleep was kind of playing songs that were somewhere between Nick Cave and Low. Like it was different, and people didn't seem to care. And I think I don't know why, but at a certain point I think that switched, where there was an expectation of like the bill all kind of has to sound the same, which I think affected stuff. But I think there's like a lot of people try to pin the decline on attendance of live music on a lot of things, and I don't think there's one answer. I think there's a lot of answers. People are going to point to things like Spotify and Netflix, and sure, I think that plays a role in it. I also personally think that a decline in media coverage in a city like Halifax for arts, a focus on arts coverage on a grander scale, like when you lose those things, people lose their touchstones for knowing about things, figuring out what they might like or what they might not like. But also you can couple that with sort of an explosion of internet coverage as well, so people are focused more on bigger things and not necessarily what's going on in their hometown. So I think there's lots and lots of that goes into it. I've always been very interested, and I'm gonna find somebody to do this someday, if not myself, to sort of do a comparison, like a record comparison of, okay, what venues were around in 1994 versus 2004 versus 2014. And my inclination is like, even though more people were going out to those shows, and there might have been sort of peaks and valleys in those regards, like I think if you start comparing those eras, there weren't really like plus or minus. I think it's people's attitudes that have changed and people's habits that have changed. But the amount of venues that we have, I think now, like in 2019, like we're probably in the bottom of a valley, But I think like there's always been underground venues. There's always been sort of like venues that aren't mainstream. Yeah. And we can't discount the importance of those venues, like to people who want to go see music and who choose to seek music out. And we have, like, if you talk to someone on a certain level, they're not going to consider Lost and Found a proper venue. But that doesn't mean that music doesn't happen there, Or they're not going to consider, like, how many times the Obey convention brings music into the North End Library. Things like this is like people do the work sometimes to make venues happen because they know that arts need to happen in the city. So there are people, I think, who would misconstrue that a little bit, and they would talk about sort of like actual venues or longevity of venues, but it's about like space and where can we find those spaces too sometimes that people, I think, forget.
Yeah, I know. I mean, but on the other end, we still have great venues and we still have great people coming out playing music. And you mentioned Obey now. I was wondering what your thoughts on festivals are.
Definitely, we're seeing like a contraction, I think, of festivals, like especially things like the like In the Dead of Winter just announced they're taking a year off. They've been a mainstay in Halifax for 14 years.
Yeah.
But a lot of the other
Oh, wow.
a lot of the big festivals that are kind of, we're used to having, like Pop Explosion, which is kind of going on 30 years of being a festival. The scale of that festival has gotten smaller purposefully, kind of bringing it back to its roots. It kind of really exploded, for lack of a better term, in the sort of mid mid-aughts to sort of like teen-aughts. And then based on, I think what happened was there was a big bubble of festivals too that really affected how these smaller festivals operated, because if a band now is being offered $20,000 for a gig in their hometown, when that's going to drive their price up, because there's like 10 festivals you can play in Ontario that are willing to pay that because they're kind of these big major festivals, so that when a smaller festival comes and offers you 10 or whatever the case may be, you're like, well, why would I do that when I can get 20 and stay home? And that's kind of a weird thing that I think people don't realize about festival booking. It's like it's not like for lack of trying. People want to have good stuff come here, but it's expensive to come here. And especially if you're not like, we're sitting here having a conversation at the tail end of Jazz Festival, which is like an ideal time to attract artists because they're on that summer festival tour circuit. A festival like Pop Explosion has a challenge in that it happens in October. So artists from the America, for example, oftentimes they're asking them to come and do one show, which increases the budget, right?
Yeah.
So these are the things that kind of go on behind the scenes, I think, that a lot of people don't realize, and present real significant challenges to some festivals. Now, that said, I think the people who are running festivals here, there's amazing music that comes here. I think Pop Explosion brings some of the best bands you'll ever see. They're very much in the same vein as Obey, like take a chance on a band and go see something, and you're going to see something incredible. I feel the same way about Sappy Fest in Sackville, New Brunswick. They bring amazing people to this neck of the woods, and sometimes those people are Charles Bradley and Arcade Fire. But then sometimes it's just like a really cool band from Montreal that you're going to see at 2:00 in the afternoon on Saturday, and they might be the best band you see all weekend or the most surprising band. So I think when it comes to festivals, there are people who are like the creative directors, the executive directors, the programmers, the bookers, who do a good job of understanding that like festivals aren't just about presenting stuff that people know. It's about taking ownership over the creativity and saying like, trust us, we're putting something amazing together for you.
Yeah, I mean, but it's also a lot of work though.
Oh yeah. I know. I work with a lot of festivals as a publicist, but I don't work in the sort of trenches of programming and booking and making the venues happen. Those are thankless jobs.
And talking about that, I remember the ECMAs where you pretty much handle media for that, and I was just there for a few days and it was crazy. Yeah. It's a madhouse.
Well, I think
how do you make it all work? Because I was just watching you pretty much make the right people get to the right place to talk to the right people.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I think some of that is time and knowledge, right? Like for me, I think part of like public relations, like you have to be a personable person. You have to kind of be out. I am lucky that I'm kind of out and about in that sector, so I know a lot of the people. I've been working with some of these people for a really long time, so if I need them to do something or if I need to call on a favor, like these are things that just kind of come as part of your Rolodex as a publicist. But I'm also like I would like to think I'm a big member of that community in general. When it comes to music in the Atlantic provinces, specifically in Halifax and Nova Scotia, like I've been doing this for almost 20 years now, and people know who I am. They know that I've got a radio show. They know I'm a publicist. They know I play in bands. So like there's like a trust that comes with some of that stuff too, to not just be some weirdo person in the background like trying to like turn the keys. It's like they know that I'm coming at them for like legit reasons, and I'm also very upfront about the things that when I do that work, is sort of like I want to put people in good situations. I want to give them good opportunities, and I want to keep that relationship that I have with folks in the media going, and also keep that relationship with the artist alive and well.
Yeah. Actually, you were saying you've been doing this for 20 years, and I think Halifax is 10 years now, 11.
It'll be 10 years in September.
Sweet. So, how did you get into doing the show? I remember you told me the story of the title. That was great. But how did you start in? How's it been 10 years now?
much like I'm learning from telling you these stories, a lot of the origins of something like Halifax is Burning is not glamorous. Like
Yeah.
I was always like really interested in radio, but funny enough, when I was in journalism school, I didn't like doing radio at all.
Why not?
I just didn't like the writing of it. Like it was so succinct, and I was like really interested in feature writing and magazine writing and narrative nonfiction and stuff like that. So when you're writing for scripts for radio, and everything's like 10 words or less, and just wasn't like fun for me.
Yeah.
And so I didn't get into radio till after journalism school. But I'd always been interested in radio. When I was a kid, I like would make like radio station tapes, like dub a tape and then dub my voice, being like doing the back sell and then introduce another song. Like I remember doing those things, so I always kind of, I guess, was interested in stuff. And I was living very close to the Dalhousie campus at the time, and just decided like, oh yeah, that's something I could do. Like I think it was like a particular summer where after I'd first, no, that's not true, I'm mixing up stories, but I don't know, I just felt like I had some time. It was something I was interested in doing. I had heard a lot about CKDU because of my interest in local music and about how influential it was and important it was to the sort of scene in the 90s and to things like the Halifax pop explosion, and having sort of a crucial role in defining a music culture in and around Halifax for a long time. So I thought that's something I would like to be part of, And I just went in and did the training and then started a show. I think the way it works for people who don't know is basically you have to do a bunch of volunteer work to kind of earn your way into the airwaves, and then from there you kind of do some tests, and that like not a written test, but like you do samples basically, and you can spend some time on air to show that you're comfortable. And I just did that all very quickly, and then I started just signing up to fill in on a slot on Tuesdays at 6:30, and it seemed to work for me, and I just, once I put together a program application, then I was in, and I have been at Tuesday at 6:30 ever since.
But then, what do you prefer, like the live shows, or when? How do you decide? I guess when you can't be there, what show you're gonna record to put up?
Yeah, I mean, I much prefer doing it live for two reasons. One, it's a timing thing. So like, there's something about being live, like you can't really correct a mistake. If I can't be there live, which I would say these days is like more often than not, I am live, because if I'm going to pre-record something at home, which I have the capability of doing, it's probably going to take me twice or three times as long, because if I mess something up, I'm going to go like, oh no, do that over again. I can do that one better. It's like recording vocal takes. It's just like, no, let's just nail it. On the radio, you just have to nail it when you're live.
Right.
And if you don't, you don't, and that's fine. And I think there's something kind of like charming about that too, hearing someone mess up on the radio or something.
God. I have a story, because I met you. I said I wanted to get a show there, and then the very first real show that I'm on, I don't know, for some reason the song played like a few hours ago, and then I press play and it just won't play, right? And I'm like, oh yeah, and this song is coming to play, and I press play and then it goes dead.
Yeah.
But then I'm like, what am I doing? Anyway, I start talking and then I look for another song to play. What's so weird?
Yeah, it's fun, but there's a little bit of magic in that, I think. Like, and hearing that, like, as a radio listener, there's something special about that too. So I prefer the live for sure. I do like doing, like, in the last couple years, I haven't really done it in, I would say, in over a year now, because just a timing thing. But I love podcasts, and I specifically love sort of the production element of podcasts. So some of my favorite podcasts are like storytelling podcasts, where they can weave in, like soundscapes or samples or whatever, so that it gives you like a clearer picture. So I would often have people on my show to do interviews and things, and we would be talking about a song, and then we'd play that song. But I thought, oh, well, since I'm sort of real into podcast zone, I'm going to go out and do interviews like in the field and set up much like a scenario like this, a couple mics in a room, and have a longer conversation with a person that I'm really interested in, and then take that home, edit it, make it really glossy, and then put like a 10-minute segment on the live show, and then push people to sort of a podcasted version. So I think there's like 15 online that I've done with various people, like some really awesome stuff too. Like, I also wanted to treat it as a way of me sort of furthering my education about music, specifically around these parts. So one of the first people I interviewed was Mike O'Neill from the Inbreds, because he was part of that community, but he wasn't from Halifax. Like, he had moved from Ontario. So I wanted to kind of get his perspective on like what all that looked like in that moment, and then I've also talked to like Jerry Granelli, who is a jazz legend who moved to Halifax in the 60s, and most people, myself included, know him best because he's the drummer on the Charlie Brown Christmas album, which has always been a crucial Christmas album in my house, and just talking to him about like how that all came together and his stories, but then having the opportunity to just talk to him about like what he's interested in now and what he's working on, and he's so community oriented and just a magnificent human being. So like creating those opportunities for myself to talk to people about things that I love, but in a way that is also teaching me, was something I was really wanting to do more with the podcast. And I think I'm hoping that there will come a time where I can sort of spend more time doing that. But for right now, I sort of just have set it aside and gone back to doing interviews live in the studio.
Oh, okay. So I'm gonna tie it up with this. We have your whole music background, and then the Publicist and the radio show. But like, I think to me, when you told me about Acadian Embassy, I feel it kind of just ties all these things that I'm super passionate about into one place. So I want to end it with this question: why did you start it, and what is your plan moving forward with Acadian Embassy?
Well, Acadian Embassy, the name came from a house that I lived in. So we kind of had this tradition amongst friends where if a group of people were living in a house, like they would just be like, oh yeah, come. Like I have friends who live at a place we call it the Castle. They're like, yeah, come over to the Castle Friday night or whatever. And so we kind of wanted to pick up a similar tradition. We rented this entire house. It was myself and my girlfriend and my friend Josh Pache, who I mentioned earlier, and his partner at the time. So the first thing we did when we moved in was like, okay, we need a name for this house. And three of the four of us were Acadians. So we decided to call it the Acadian Embassy. And then Josh and I had run a record label. I use full quotations around all of that sentence. We had kind of started this thing called No Scene Records when we were in the establishment, and it was sort of similar to some of the other collectives that we had seen. We just kind of wanted to put music out, help people put music out that were friends of ours or who weren't, attached to some of the existing labels and stuff. So we tried to create this little community for ourselves. Didn't like pan out super well, but then we decided to do it again under this title, the Acadian Embassy. And really the label was started as a way of saying like, okay, we're in this house, and then we kind of, our basement was our jam space. We had a loft upstairs that was sort of like, it ended up being a bedroom at one point, but it was sort of like, could be whatever. And then we had an office that we had set aside to kind of have, label affairs, running there. So we basically wanted to start the label as a document of what was going on in that house creatively. So the bands that we were playing in, the people who were coming through, we really wanted to sort of create this little community around the things that we were doing and the things that we were interested in. So it really started there. And then it kind of it morphed, I think, over time because of the name. And it's still very much that. Like, it's a very small roster. Right now, it's only myself who runs it. And, really, there's 2 to 3 active bands on that roster right now. Choir Parade, a band from Yarmouth called Rain Over St. Ambrose, and Fossil Cliffs, which is Mike Dion's new band that I play bass in sometimes, but he has kind of like a rotating cast of people. And then we all, like Josh's band at the time, Kuato, was a mainstay on that label. Anyway, all this to say that like the music and the community and then sort of questions about the name, like where is it coming from? It really led us down this path of like talking about cultural identity a lot more in ways that we never really had done. And really kind of started spurring these conversations about like, okay, well, when we talk about being Acadians, we're talking about this experience for us because we're from this very specific part of the world. How does that differ from other Acadian experiences? We had also played in a band like with Sleepless Nights. Josh and Aaron and I were all Acadians. We all went to an Acadian high school. We all came from different Acadian communities. And we would go across the country and talk to people and it would come up in conversation. And we realized quickly that people around the world, like around the country, don't know what Acadians are sometimes. And for us, that seemed so weird, not only because we're from here, but because that was just like something that was really drilled into us from a young age, was the story and the history of this ancestry that we all shared, which is quite a fascinating ancestry when you think about it in context of like, the colonial settlement of this country we now call Canada, and the timing of everything. The first French settlers who came to Nova Scotia came here in 1604. And then we're talking about Canada developing in the sort of 19th century, so there's this whole vast history of this ancestry that we have of people who come here, who settle some lands in really unique ways, who develop agricultural skills based on the geography and based on the sort of limitations of the ocean and all these kind of things. And then this tremendous story of a cultural expulsion at the hands of the British, because it was a French and British territory. Obviously it was an indigenous territory, but at that time the colonial kind of structures were fighting over this parcel of land that we now call Nova Scotia and parts of New Brunswick. And then the sort of end result becomes the French descendants get physically exported from the country at the hands of the English. So like, to me, I'm a history nerd, and that story is amongst a lot of really interesting stories that I think there are to be told, but it also is a story that we know quite well, and there are people out there who don't know. So anyway, this is a long-winded way of saying, like, we wanted some of that to come through in the art that we were making and the discussions that we were having, and not to say that every single band that we work with has like an Acadian slant to it, but we always try to bring sort of an Acadian mentality to it, in that, like, the idea of community is very important in like small Acadian communities, and working together and helping each other, especially if times are tough. So we wanted those morals and those values to be reflective of the way we did business, the way that we chose to work with artists, the way that we brought people into the fold. And then personally, I started using that as a way of like doing like real deep dive into sort of concepts of cultural identity. What does it mean to be Acadian? What does it mean to be Acadian in 2019? How is that shifting? I'm really interested in these conversations. So now I kind of use the embassy both as this means of supporting and helping artists, but also as a way to sort of have deeper conversations and to use it as a platform to be like, we're going to talk about this,
Wow. That's super profound. And I actually, like I said, I'm going to ask you, because I want to take my show to the next level, and I'm just mirroring everything I do based on Halifax's body.
I don't know if that's a good strategy.
Thanks so much for coming in today, Trevor.
Oh, thanks. I mean, I'm always happy to have a chat.
This is the Blackout Podcast. Thanks for listening.